Okay, this is the second of the four for Tuesday, and we now move to Dr. Charles Townsend from California. And his proposal was the idea that during the New Deal that the American people and the American government needed to take care of the elderly, that in a nation as prosperous as ours that was doing as much to try and deal with the depression as we were, that old people should not be dying on the streets, poor and destitute. So what he basically proposed becomes, in 1934, Social Security. And this is the idea that the government will take money from your income before you actually get it, and hold it and then give it back to you as part of your retirement once you end your working career. So in a sense, it's forced retirement. Now, the the controversial part of this will be that when the legislation is passed, it's not only taken from your paycheck, but your employer must match that amount. So if it takes 24 bucks out of your paycheck, your employer has to add 24 bucks. So you'd be getting 48 bucks put into your retirement fund. Townsend pushes hard for this, and of course it does become the Social Security program, which if you look at it, if you get paid by check today, if you look under FICA, that's how much is being taken out. We've talked about this before, but this is a program that was never really intended to be the only thing that people would use for their retirement. But over the years, we've added a lot more things to it for the elderly, for others. And as a consequence, the price, or the price tag for the program, has risen to the point where, although we pay into it, the money is not being held anymore for us. It's really just being spent immediately to take care of the elderly who are around today. So we talked earlier about how this is something that your generation will probably have to struggle with at some point during your careers. Okay, moving on. 1933, when the Democrats take over, we get the 21st Amendment, which reverses prohibition, and we've talked quite a bit about that. There was quite a celebration, to say the least, when prohibition ended. And you see the picture here in the middle. The Budweiser Corporation actually sent the Clydesdales with a whole bunch of beer to the White House, and another one up to Capitol Hill once all the states that were necessary had agreed to removing the Prohibition Amendment. Okay, the 1934 off-year elections. Now this is important because it's really the first time the American people have an opportunity to comment on the New Deal. And although the president isn't up for re-election, and of course only 1/3 of the Senate, but the entire House. And as you can see, the Republicans are totally wiped out here, where they lose more seats in both houses. It was the greatest margin of seats ever held by one party in the Senate, and it almost erased the Republicans as a national party. The areas where you see red are actually the areas that at that point were voting for the Republicans, or had Republican senators. So you can see the blue states very much were pushing Democrats. Okay, here's the Social Security Act and then the Wagner Labor Act. So the Social Security Act not only takes your money and holds it for you as a pension, it also gives you unemployment insurance. So if you are unemployed, it will help you to make your way to some extent while you're looking for a job. It also gave aid to dependent citizens. These were people who were infirmed in some way, or if they were children and they had parents who were unable to take care of them, that the fund was to be used for that as well. And as I said, the employer and the employee both were forced to contribute. And the idea was that the amount you put in initially would then be returned to you, and that's it. But of course, over time, it's adjusted so that it just continues to pay you, even if you've used up the money that you put in there. It's a very popular program and has been around for a long time. We add more and more things to it, as we said, and it has become very costly. But it's also something many people rely on to take care of them in their later years. Now, I want to point out the Wagner Labor Act. This is in a bill that's passed during the New Deal, and of course Roosevelt signs it. And it's really the Democrats taking advantage of their great majority. And it's interesting because we talked about this before, that back during Reconstruction, when the Republicans had a huge majority, and they passed the 15th Amendment, which is really designed just to help the Republican Party because it really wasn't needed at the time. And so they, in essence, took advantage of their success. Well, the Democrats are going to turn the tables here and will take advantage of their success, and they'll pass legislation that forces businesses to allow unionization. Of course, this helps the Democrats because unions are very pro-Democrat, and it also created the National Labor Relations Board. And this is an organization that's still around today and very much works with the unions to try and make sure that the unions are treated well by businesses, and in fact is very, very pro-union. So bottom line, the Democrats take advantage of the situation to help one of their major constituencies. That leads to the election of 1936, and Roosevelt had been worried about the push from the left and whether or not he would be able to get the nomination and then ultimately re-elected. But what we see in 1936 is the solid FDR coalition that we had talked about back in 28 is now very strong and very formidable. And you can see how much Roosevelt is successful here in that only Vermont and Maine will vote for his opponent, Alf Landon, the Republican. And why not? The change since 1933 when he had taken office was pretty dramatic. 6 million jobs added, the national income is 50% higher than when Hoover left office. Factory output had doubled. The soup lines, the apple and pencil sellers, and the Hoovervilles are all gone at this point. Now the basic depression continues. However, Roosevelt at this point is often and rightfully so seen as somebody who had stepped in and helped to save the country. So what we find, however, is that the momentum of the New Deal dies by 1937. We said the basic depression continues. Although there's a lot more proposals for things, the country is not in the mood to go too much farther to the left. And in fact, one of the things that's interesting is that it's during this time period that Roosevelt does something that even the historians that almost adore him comment was something that went a little bit too far, and we need to talk about it because it is important. It's probably on the AP exam, and it's called the court packing situation. We know Congress was very pro-Democrat. We know the president obviously would sign a lot of the New Deal legislation. The problem, however, was the Supreme Court, which was packed with Republicans. And as those who didn't like the New Deal programs challenged them in court, these finally got to the court around 1935, and the Republican Supreme Court began to dismantle some of the programs by ruling that they were unconstitutional. Well, Roosevelt was pretty worried about this because this could actually throw the entire recovery into a tailspin. And so one of the things that happened here was something that some people believe was him overstepping his bounds, even with all the great power that he was given by the American people at the time of the crisis of the Depression. And what he did here was he, in essence, threatened to get legislation passed that would force anybody over 70 years of age that was on the court to retire, which of course is not in the Constitution. You have that job for life if you choose to, once you have been confirmed as a justice on the Supreme Court, unless you're impeached or decide to retire. So he seemed to threaten that, and of course if that had happened, if that legislation had been passed, then it would have actually allowed him to pack the court with Democrats, because a big chunk of the Republicans were 70 or over. Now, when he decided to do this, even his biggest supporters thought, you know what, this sounds like he's pushing a little too far. He owns two parts of the three branches. Sort of sweeping the court out of his way was something that looked like maybe he was trying to become a dictator. And so it's actually one of the few things he did that most historians agree had a negative effect on his presidency. And in fact, as you see here in 1938, the Democrats actually lost seats in Congress, although they kept a majority. That was the off-year election of 1938, and many historians blame the court packing, as it was called, as he was trying to supposedly pack the court with with Democrats. They blame that for the loss of seats in 1938. Was he really trying to take over the government and become a dictator? Probably not. He was worried about New Deal programs. And in fact, the threat that he made, caused the court to sort of slow down in ruling against his laws, or New Deal laws, and so a lot of it would survive. So overall, what about Roosevelt and the New Deal? Well, a lot of historians make this particular argument, that it was successful because it stopped the downward slide of the economy. But here are the things that Roosevelt really should be known for as president. First, he, as it says, recreated the modern presidency. And what we mean by that is that earlier presidents, starting with Washington, looking at Jackson and at Lincoln, of course, and Teddy Roosevelt, had begun to create the presidency that we know today. Today, we look to the president much quicker than we do either of the two other branches to get things done, and as really the leader of the three branches. Roosevelt definitely took the U.S. government in that direction and the presidency. He attracted people to Washington, highly skilled, who came to Washington to do good and not to do well. Now, what that really refers to is that somehow in the brain trust that he brought together, the vast majority of them were not corrupt. They had a great opportunity with all the money and programs flying around, but somehow he managed to pick people who came to Washington to try and help their country. There was some corruption, but it was very small in comparison to what it could have been. As a president, he dominated the front pages like no president before him, and only presidents who get in trouble later will probably dominate the media the way that he did. He caused many Americans to have contact with the federal government for the first time. Many people that lived in many of the states had never really seen the federal government have any real direct effect on their lives. They'd heard of it, they knew it dealt with the military and other things, but now because of these new federal programs, Americans were immediately connected directly to the federal government. He personified the state as the protector of the people, and this is something that has many good aspects to it and some other bad ones that we'll be talking about later. He moved the government from helping big business, which is what the Republicans tended to do, to the business of big government. So this, again, positive and negative. The federal government became very large and then continues to grow through this moment. But on the other hand, it's something that the American people demanded, and in fact he was the man that took the reins and did what the American people wanted him to do. He did all this when nations around the globe were turning to communism, socialism, and fascism to solve their ills. Although you could argue that the New Deal was somewhat socialist, slightly. The truth is that when nations around the world were collapsing from the Depression, Roosevelt actually managed to do enough to stop the downward slide of the economy, change the attitude of the people to an extent, and did so without having to throw our basic form of government out the window, which in other places didn't happen. Now I want to mention this, go back for a second and talk about his impact in the media. One of the things that made the New Deal work were his fireside chats. He was the first president to use the radio and in any kind of real organized way. And as one American woman said about these fireside chats, he talked to me about my government. And so he really personalized things for the American people. And as a leader, he really set the bar very high in his ability to help the American people to move forward and to understand what was going on. Those fireside chats had a lot to do with the New Deal being successful, and as we'll see, had a lot to do with World War II as well. Now, on the negative side, he did leave many problems unsolved, which some people argued he could have. And there's no question that by increasing the size of the federal government, there are many new problems that will be created. Okay, we're going to just briefly mention World War II and then pick up with it again in the next segment. While all this is going on, of course, Europe is having lots of events take place, and of course the biggest one is the rise of the Nazis in Germany and the rise of fascism in Japan as well. So we'll see that Roosevelt, very similarly to Wilson, had been a Democrat who was elected to deal with domestic issues, but he'll be known for his handling of a world war. But in this case, there's no debating that the United States will be successful in World War II.